We appreciate you being here at the Chesapeake Forum. I'm Linda Earls, and I'm wearing two hats today because I serve on the board as the secretary of Chesapeake Forum, but I also am a professor of English at Chesapeake College, and this is my boss. I'm pleased that he's here with us today. We brought him back into the classroom. Dr. Cliff Coppersmith comes to us with a long and really meritorious background. He has over 30 years in the education field, but he also has a military background. He was in the Army, but he also Army Reserves, National Guard, but he also comes to us with 3 degrees and four degrees.
One's an associate, so
but still it counts. It absolutely counts. Laid the foundation for everything to come. He is in his 5th year, I can't believe it, as the president of Chesapeake College. But he has a degree in anthropology and history, which brings the wealth of information that he's going to share with us today from College of Eastern Utah. And I'm just proud to have him here because he's not only my boss, he's also a dear friend. So I welcome him, and we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end. But thank you so much, Cliff, for being here today.
Well, first of all, I consider Linda a colleague, especially in our work together with the Chesapeake Forum. I thank her for the opportunity, as I do Lynn, and thank you for setting me up today in particular. It's a great day to be talking about this topic because we have 3 kind of corresponding things happening. We have Veterans Day in just a few days. We have this Native American History or Heritage Month as well. And then just last weekend, the National Monument for Native American Military Service was dedicated on the Mall in Washington, D.C. There was a great article in the Washington Post this morning about that event, which all ties in together. What I'm talking about today is the history and value and presence of Native Americans in service in the military. And even though my title says Indians in the Army, they serve in all the branches. And in fact, one of the visitors to one of the participants in the monument dedication this last weekend was an Air Force air traffic controller. So our Native American soldiers, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, Marines, they serve in all our branches, and I certainly want to make sure we all understand that participation is very broad. I have 3 kind of general topics I hope to address this afternoon, right? And one thing I want to start off with a little story. I completed my Ph.D. at Oklahoma State University, where an individual you might know about, Stephen Ambrose, was asked to give a guest lecture. And of course, you may know him. My favorite book is Undaunted Courage. It's about the Lewis and Clark expedition. But he's best known for writing the book Band of Brothers, which was turned into an award-winning film miniseries on HBO.
I'm watching that right now.
Yeah, it's a great show. But anyways, Stephen Ambrose was brought to OSU. One of my professors was a colleague of his, and he was supposed to talk about D-Day. Well, he never even got off the boats. He never even got to D-Day because he spent so much time talking about other things. I'm sure it was valuable, but I'm hoping I can get beyond D-Day today in terms of my plan. I want to address 3 kind of corollary topics. My first is I want to talk most importantly about Native Americans themselves, their service, their motivations, and how many Native Americans remember and memorialize their service with participation in powwow activities. And I'll just ask real quick, has anybody been to a powwow?
Yes.
Okay, well, there's at least one of us. Your homework assignment, if you ever get the chance to go to a powwow, there's several on the Eastern Shore throughout the year. There's one in Vienna, Maryland, that's actually sponsored by local Native American communities. There's plenty on the Western Shore. University of Maryland has at least one big one a year. But a powwow is just a fascinating picture into what I would call modern contemporary Native American culture, which we have to remember is not static, it's changing all the time, just like everybody's culture does. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about powwow culture. It's a fascinating topic and really closely links to military service, as many Native Americans continue to value their military service and their military experience in the context of participating in powwow music and dance. Then I'm going to talk a little bit, but not too much, about some historical work I did looking at really the antecedents of the full integration of Native Americans into military service in the 1890s with the first experiments of enlisting soldiers in the U.S. Army out west, as the U.S. Army still thought of itself as a frontier fighting force, trying to pacify the rest of the Native American populations. And even though that was coming to an end, the Army didn't really realize that yet. So experimenting with the enlistment of Native American soldiers in regular units was something new. Prior to that time, most Native Americans participated in auxiliary or scouts, kind of on a temporary kind of basis from engagement to engagement or campaign to campaign. But the military enlistment experiment also illustrates the activities of the professional officer corps in the 1890s as it, like the rest of America, became more professional, more rational, more educated. This happens to every field: lawyers, doctors, teachers, university professors, the nursing discipline. As all these professional fields required expertise and knowledge began to professionalize, and you have licensure and you have associations, and that's where we see the professionalization of the Army Officer Corps get involved in promoting Native American military service on a regular basis. And then finally, as an epilogue of sorts, I'm going to be covering very briefly the history of Native American military service in the 20th and 21st centuries. And again, illustrating how dynamic this is. When I first revised my notes for this presentation today, I was talking about how things are kind of, our extraction from Afghanistan a few months ago, we seem to had been on a kind of a course of, withdrawing a little bit from the Middle East. Of course, in the last several weeks, that's all turned over upside down in a very serious situation. But I guarantee you that in the front lines, you're going to find Native American soldiers, airmen, Marines dealing with what's happening presently in the Middle East. I also wish to remember the sacrifice and service of all soldiers as I begin my presentation today. I come from a military family. I have very strong heritage in Native American history myself. I'm the ninth and eighth grandchild of Miami women that married French fur traders, and one in particular was actually a lieutenant of LaSalle, famous explorer. This is my great-grandmother times 9 generations. She was the first recorded marriage, which is now Chicago, Illinois, when she married Pierre Hugh, who was a Frenchman, and ironically eventually abandoned her and returned to France. But the only children and descendants he had were from that marriage, because all of his children in France either died in childbirth or in infancy, or they became Catholic priests. So the only descendants he had, including me today, came from his alliance with a Native American woman named Elizabeth, who was Catholic. I began my personal as well as professional interest in military history at Carlisle Barracks, where I did the research for some parts of this presentation today, where I was really interested and fascinated with Indian Scout service in the Army. I've been interested in Native American history since I was a kid. I grew up in Western New York on the boundaries of the Seneca Reservation. It's located along the banks of the Allegheny River. One of my childhood friends was a Seneca, and so I've always had an interest in Native American history, which after doing some other things as an undergraduate, I decided to pursue a master's degree and a Ph.D. in history, first at St. Bonaventure University and later my Ph.D. in doctoral studies at Oklahoma State University in Oklahoma. Along the journey, I worked with the CIA for a couple of years, and I'll be quite frank, one of the reasons I went and gravitated towards Native American history is that when I left the CIA, I had to sign a document that if I ever published anything remotely connected to my work as an intelligence officer, I had to submit it for review to the CIA, and I didn't want to deal with that. So I thought I'd major in something so far away from what I did in federal service that I would never have to deal with that. Probably my most intimate work, aside from my work in Montana with Native American communities as an educator before my job here at Chesapeake, is I did graduate work, including field work at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, with the Fort Sill Apache tribe of Oklahoma, which is a group of Native Americans that were imprisoned. Literally the last engagement, the last battle, what we call the 30 Years' War out west between the frontier and settlers from the United States and the Army, the U.S. Army, and Native Americans who resisted that, was the surrender of Geronimo, who has almost become a legendary mythic figure, but actually was a natural human being. But because of his exploits and the controversy of his existence, his entire community was literally put on trains and sent into prisoner of war status, which they occupied for nearly 30 years. They first were in Florida, and that didn't last very long because they were dying of tropical diseases, which they had no experience or exposure prior. So they eventually ended up in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And the idea was at the end of the Indian Wars, Fort Sill would be transferred to them as a reservation. Well, that plan went out the window, both because of local economic interests that were very dependent on the U.S. military, but also the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, in which Fort Sill became very valuable as an artillery post for trained artillerists. You got to shoot large numbers of ammunition, cannons, and so forth, and you want lots of space to do that. So that's when the Fort Sill Apache had to be either housed out west, and a portion of the community returned to New Mexico, which is more or less where they had come from. New Mexico, Arizona, they were very widely scattered folks at the time that they left the West. And the other part of the community, about 60 or 70 individuals, decided to stay at Fort Sill. And they were allotted independent allotments from the old Kiowa Comanche Reservation, and they settled down and really much were acculturated and assimilated into the local economy, but they managed to maintain their identity through the years, and those are the folks I did my work on. So my graduate work focused on American Indian cultural identity, and as you might guess, there's been a lot of loss along the way. They obviously don't live out west, hunting buffalo. And in my part of the world where I grew up, they don't, canoe the Allegheny River like they did 300 or 400 years ago. These people have changed, they've adapted, and they've dealt with the societies around them, sometimes even competing Native American communities in many ways that have an impact on their culture as well. But through all time and through all these experiences, there's been some ability of these communities to maintain their identity, and in some ways, some traditional cultural activities, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. A couple of acknowledgments. I want to thank Linda Earls for her invitation to participate in this today, but I also want to thank one of my most gifted colleagues, now retired Dr. Clyde Ellis, who taught Native American history at Elon University in North Carolina, South Carolina, I can never keep track of that. But Elon is a well-regarded institution down in the South, and he has studied in-depthly powwow culture, and in fact, his dissertation, which he eventually published, was a history of one of the Indian schools. It was run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs during the late 1800s. And of course, that's all come back to present knowledge because our current Secretary of the Interior is a Native American woman who has drawn attention back to the role that Indian boarding schools played in many negative ways in terms of their impacts on Native American communities. But that's not news. There's been scholarly work done on Indian boarding schools now going on for 30 years. It's a very active part of history writing about Native American communities during that time period. And that will figure into a little bit into my discussion about powwow. I have three intended outcomes for today. One is to increase awareness in general of the Native American contribution to U.S. military history. I also hope to increase your understanding of the role that is played in contemporary American Indian society with service in the military, including combat. Wartime service, in particular by Native American men and women, has directly contributed to a reconnection or a continuing connection with the warrior tradition that started with Plains Indian warrior societies on the Great Plains. So-called dog soldiers, you might have seen those. It was a very popular theme in American cowboy and Indian movies back in the 1950s. But there were what were called warrior societies that maintained order. They took control of the encampment when it was breaking camp and setting up camp. They controlled everybody so nobody went off and chased the buffalo away before they were ready to go actually hunt them and have a successful hunt. And in that process, there were music and dance traditions associated with those military societies that in many ways are very visible today with powwow culture. And of course, I also want to, kind of, as I mentioned before, kind of want to end up with an epilogue about where we are today with the very presence of Native American military service to this continuing day up until the wars that we are currently and been involved with in Southwest and Southeast Asia and literally all over the planet. So I'm probably way behind on my PowerPoint, so let's advance to the next slide, see if I covered everything. I don't think I have.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were doing
Oh, I did. That's right. Yeah. And by the way, I would like to be as informal as possible, so if you ever have any questions or you have a comment you'd like to make, please just raise your hand, or if you're out in TV land on Zoom, I see we have one participant. Ronald, welcome to our presentation today. It's lovely to see you out there. So I think I've done this, my own background, graduate school, U.S. Army, cultural identity. Okay, we took care of that.
Moving. Okay, now you should get.
There we go. So those are my outcomes. You can take a look at that for just a second, but I think I've covered all that.
Yours is not working, huh?
No, there it is. Okay, so there's my overview. So I have started with the present. Going to talk about powwow, and then what we're going to do is listen to some actual music, which is kind of emblematic of the kinds of things you will hear and see in a powwow. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the participation of our young officer corps in the 1890s in terms of regularizing in the Indian military service, which opened the door for integration. Because unlike African Americans, Native Americans were fully integrated in the military at the beginning of the 1900s, particularly during World War I. They were enlisted alongside their white comrades, and throughout the 20th century, Native Americans have served in integrated units in the
You know what, did we turn it off?
we turn
You
them
may have turned it off.
Well,
Oh,
this
no,
one
you got
here.
it. Okay.
There we go. So, as a current example, Brigadier General Joan Matthews, she's our first Native American female general officer. She served in the, I think it was the Wisconsin Army National Guard, combat helicopter pilot in Iraq, eventually went into training pilots, and eventually became a leader in the Wisconsin National Guard. And she is a Lac de Flambeau band citizen from the Lake Superior Chippewa tribe and was actually born on the reservation. So in many ways, I think she illustrates the presence and impact of Native Americans across the board, and also I think in many ways outlines the diversity of today's modern military force. Women and men, of course, now serving in combat together in nearly all the branches, if not all the branches. Not quite sure the Marines are.
Yeah,
They're serving in combat roles in the Marines now. Yeah. Okay. Well, I take that back. I have a close connection. She's going to go Marine Aviation. I assume that means combat.
That is combat.
Yeah.
And there is an adage that every Marine is a rifleman.
True. Very true. Very true. You know, I got to say aside, I've served alongside Marine Corps folks my entire career, and there's something very special about them. When I was in the CIA, there was actually a Marine mafia. They got together every year. That didn't happen with us Marine guys. So, okay, so I think I finished up with your Joan Matthews. Now, just a little word about where this presentation came from. I was actually out in Montana back in 2017 and contacted by a former boss of mine who I'd served with in the CIA, and he wanted me to come and do this presentation for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which has been the first time I was back in those kind of environments in many, many years. And National Geospatial Intelligence Agency now does all that imagery stuff, satellite stuff, all the mapping agencies are now housed there. Enormous facility just outside of Woodbridge, Virginia. I think before you get to the Occoquan Bridge on the right side as you go down. I don't think you can see it from the highway, but if you want to take a look at something and you want to know what's going on there, just take a look at the imagery of that place on Google. And there's a lot of water cooling towers there. So they have a lot of computing power to do all the stuff they do there, but it was a wonderful opportunity for me to it was basically this time of the year, I was doing a Native American history heritage thing for the federal government as a professional development opportunity for both civilians and military folks that work there. So, Brigadier General Joanna Matthews retired now, but at the time she was part of my activity back at the Geospatial Intelligence Agency. It's hard to keep track of that one. All right. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about contemporary Indian and military service. It's in the headlines constantly. I did a web search, and there's all kinds of newspaper articles about their visibility, their presence, and quite frankly, their sacrifice. There's been a lot of, I don't know if you're doing it or am I doing it?
You're doing it?
It doesn't seem it is. Maybe I'm not pointing at the right place.
So
There you go.
with the youth, the Indian culture youth, are they go into military service as a way to get out and see the world and do?
All of those things. Want to get out of town, lack of economic opportunity at home, but a very strong part of the tradition is serving the military as their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers. And of course, now there's women serving for the same reasons. So that very strong military tradition that's been long running in Native American communities is also part.
Is that a patriotism towards
Absolutely a patriotism thing. Even back in the early 1900s, it would seem to be counterintuitive that at a time in which Native American people had very vivid memories of the government persecuting them or militarily trying to conquer them, you find images of Native Americans with American flags. And one of the coolest things about powwow culture, and I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself, but I can't help myself, it's just such a fascinating story. The very agents of acculturation, the very agents that were trying to suppress Native American dance and music traditions, also promoted it. And my favorite example of this is the Wild West shows. You all remember the Wild West shows? Before television and radio, your entertainment, and I have fascinating pictures of Olean, New York. Okay, this is Western New York. Nobody knows where Olean is unless you know where St. Bonaventure University. But Olean, New York had the Wild West show up. And I belong to a Facebook history page, and a good friend of mine runs the local archives, and once in a while he throws up these great pictures. And there's a Wild West show going right down the middle of Olean, New York. At the time, there were 300 Wild West shows running around the world, but particularly the United States. And this was the entertainment of the day, along with the Barnum and Bailey Circus. And the Wild West shows would feature shootouts like the OK Corral. They would reenact Indian massacres. And oftentimes there were kind of like museum-type tableaus and exhibitions where Native Americans would actually demonstrate like a traditional home site, like a teepee, and the women cooking and the men doing their thing. And those are very popular forms of entertainment. And for Native Americans, it was a way to make a living, see the world, and also continue some aspect of traditional lifeway. They would be wearing their traditional clothing, they would be making their tools. In some cases, they were chasing white people around on horseback. And this was a very strong component of what became the powwow. So if you go to a powwow today, and we're going to do this right now, I'm going to show you what a powwow looks like at the very beginning. Okay, so real quick, what did you see there?
One fellow with a combat infantry badge.
Right on. What else did you see there? Very present at the very beginning. All the service flags. The U.S. Army, Marine Corps, I'm sure the Air Force is in there somewhere. Obviously, a lot of folks still wearing their uniforms from their time of service. So that's called the grand entry. And if you go to a really big powwow, that's just like one small part of it. But every powwow that I've ever been to starts off with a tribute to veterans.
So you're wearing your green utilities?
They can, but sometimes they wear like the vest. I mean, it's all over the place. You have all the military associations that some of us belong to, like Veterans of Foreign Wars, they're very engaged with that. So you'll see everything from civilian dress, native dress, accompanied with military dress. But the thing is, everybody's invited to participate. So even if you're not in and you're in the bleachers, they want you to come down and be recognized. And yes, ma'am.
Do you have to be military to join in that parade?
No, there's many aspects of powwow that everybody can be invited onto the floor, even if you just want to be there to recognize your veteran that you're thinking of, or the veterans that are there. But the grand entry, which is really lovely, comes right out of the Wild West shows. And before the Wild West shows, if you read about your French fur traders and the connections of what were called, what were those things called? The rendezvous. The rendezvous, when you had the French fur traders, the free trappers out west would, get together with their Native American traders and counterparts and economic partners, and of course women and men were doing all kinds of things in these activities. But those rendezvous reflected some of the ceremonies you see on Native American traditional Plains culture, where there's these grand gatherings. Like you've heard of Custer's Last Stand, right? That's actually a misnomer. It's called the Battle of the Bighorn, and there were survivors, by the way. They weren't white; they were Native American, lots of them. But bottom line is that great encampment that Custer attacked was not a military thing. It was a gathering of multiple tribes celebrating the seasons, getting together to find marriage partners, trade, horses, pelts, food items, luxury goods. And so what you see with the powwow culture is a reflection of those past traditions. And I got to tell you a great joke about it. So I had a good Cheyenne friend. The Battle of Little Bighorn occurs, it's just south of Billings, right off I-90, I think. I drove past it. I'm a Native American historian. I'm driving to Billings, moving to Billings, and I've been writing about Little Bighorn for years, and it's been never visited there, and I drove right by it because it's right off the highway. But a good friend of mine who's Cheyenne, this is a joke. Actually, not really a joke. It's really to a certain extent. He talks about the Battle of Little Bighorn, and I'm going to try to get this right. The Sioux took the credit, the Cheyenne won the battle, and the Crow ended up with the land. And he also told me that his community still has a pennant from the 7th Cavalry in their possession. I've never heard that anywhere. But, so anyways, that's Montana, which is fascinating Indian country. And Little Bighorn, if you've never been, is a really interesting place. It's kind of like my Civil War battlefield experiences where I saw you hear bugles and the sound.
Do they do reenactments there then, or?
They do not do reenactments at Little Bighorn, but there's obviously actually it's really interesting. You can see how the whole thing fell apart in terms of the army, because you see these stones where the actual soldiers were recovered, and they were obviously interned at the time, but they were left scattered all over the battlefield where they died. So today there are monuments, the military gravestones, for each of the soldiers that were identified where they fell. And you literally, if you read your books, you can see where the original engagement occurred, and then of course as things fell apart, panic ensues, everybody man for himself. You can see the scattering for those signs. But anyways, I'm digressing. But the point of this is that's an example of what happens in a powwow: the singing, the drumming, the dancing, and the procession. So
is a powwow today still an opportunity to trade back and forth?
oh yes, that's a very good point. I probably wouldn't have brought it up if you hadn't asked the question. It's very economic. There's art, crafts, there's competition. Many of the powwows there's competition, and I was just talking to Clyde Ellis, my good friend down at Elon, and he was telling me that he had just gone to a powwow where they paid $9,000 to have a group come in from Oklahoma to provide the music. And that's a very, very visible part of powwow culture. It's economic. For some of these folks, it's how they make a living. And they literally, there's a circuit all over the country of powwow culture. And it's even international. The Germans love this stuff. And in fact, you actually have, for lack of a better word, European Anglos or white people actually have their own powwows. That's a whole other topic of discussion, because that's getting into cultural appropriation. But there's a very strong interest around the world in Native American culture, and in particular, powwow music and dance. So what I'd like to do now is turn to some very specific examples, a couple of them. These are recorded songs, one of them recorded by a good friend of mine, Eric Lassica, who worked with me in Oklahoma. I worked with Fort Sill Apache, Clyde worked with the Comanches, and Eric worked with Kiowas. And Eric in particular, he actually did a study of what we call a Kiowa musicology, and actually he did a publication on Kiowa hymns, the Christian organizations that the Kiowas are associated with. So Eric recorded a lot of music on these powwows occurring in Oklahoma, and to give you a sense of scale, sometimes powwows are a family thing. You'll have like 20, 30, 40 people in somebody's backyard out on the plains somewhere in Oklahoma. And then, of course, there's giant powwows that have thousands and thousands of participants. So this is Billy Evans' horse, Kiowa, and I want you to listen very carefully. to what he's talking about, where you're going to hear obviously references to the military, but the idea of longing, missing your sweetheart, missing your family, missing your home ground as a result of your service.
You had work first. Okay. Oops. Yeah.
Are you clicking on that icon?
I am, and it's not letting me.
It had a little,
Try again.
it had a little soundtrack thing button on the bottom.
Yeah,
Yeah, sometimes it'll bring up a box and actually push play.
that's what I was trying to.
Do you need to go back to slideshow presentation?
I think that's what she's trying to do.
It worked before.
Yeah, it did.
So,
Let me try it.
wait, you forgot.
There you go.
Go back up to slideshow.
Get back in there.
Yeah.
See if it'll let me click.
There you go.
See that down below? It's,
Okay, it's playing the intro volume up.
Yeah, it's all the way up. That's what I'm confused about. I can hear sound, but
you can?
I
Is it
I
coming,
can hear like,
it's coming through this, it's not, it's HDMI still attached to it.
So this is where I'll talk about Star Trek, no, Star Trek, Twilight Zone. Remember the William Shatner episode where there's a bird gremlins
Yeah.
taking a plane apart? Sir, go ahead.
So, we don't hear much about Native American history in high schools or in undergraduate experiences.
So we don't hear a whole lot about history at all in high school and high experience. That's the first one.
Okay.
Yeah.
there's
Um,
sound.
My limited experience, like many years ago, I've attended the Indo-Canada Foreign Affairs Conference for decades, and my assignment was to host Pete Brown, author of Very Hard Good Name.
Sure.
And we brought him in to talk about foreign relations between the Indian nations and the U.S. government
Sure.
years ago. So, what kind of lesson can we learn from, I think, the profound failures that we had between us and Native Americans?
You're gonna have to repeat that,
Repeat what?
his question.
Okay, oh, that's fine. The question is regarding and we're really kind of off topic, but it's certainly, it's germane, what we try to see if we get this to work. The kind of the tortured relationship, the very problematic relationship between the United States government and our Native American communities. And of course, this goes back to the colonial period. And of course, very early in American history, after this founding of the United States, we had a Supreme Court decision that defined Native American communities as dependent nations. And so that was the foundation for the treaties that we set up that supposedly guaranteed them their land as long as the sun shines, as long as the wind blows, and of course then we would violate the treaty. And then there's a long sad story of gradual dispossession when the American military force got to the point where it could conquer Native American communities that no longer could defend themselves through a combination of factors. Mostly it was military force ultimately, but also disease played a huge role in our ability as Europeans to conquer Native Americans because they were not exposed to many of the diseases that became so rampant, but also it's just population. But as long as Native American communities maintained those viable populations, for example, as the Sioux did, they defended themselves for several decades until really things just got so overwhelming. And in particular, even though the Battle of Little Bighorn was a huge Native American success, ultimately it galvanized the American government to do what it had to do to relegate Indians to reservations, which of course what that conflict was all about. And part of it was actually the deliberate extermination of the buffalo. The buffalo had become literally the foundation of Plains Indian economy, food, raiment, and trade. And this is another irony, was the acquisition of the horse and firearms that allowed Native Americans to do that. Because prior to that time, they had been kind of part-time hunters, part-time agriculturalists, where they would raise corn, beans, and squash in the river valleys and hunt buffalo and other species kind of on a part-time basis. But then the firearm and the horse gave them the mobility and the firepower to actually go out into the Great Plains and hunt the buffalo. It almost exclusively became the foundation of their diet. And correspondingly, they had a huge population expansion because of the success of that particular economic and kind of food producing system, which was brought to an end.
Oh, my dearest Uncle Sam is calling me. I must go. Will you wait for me, dear? Don't you worry, don't you cry.
Well, that may have been hard to hear up there in Zoom land, but he's talking about answering the call and then saying goodbye to his sweetheart. And so there's English, mixed in with the, obviously the Native American language. So the next section is a little more verbal and narrative form. This is a testimonial at a Desert Storm, Desert Shield related powwow, in which this person talks about meeting, their comrades, and kind of in the same vein what we just learned. It's a little longer, so we get that to work.
I want y'all to come out and dance with these two young men. They're happy to meet each other. For 23 years, they haven't seen each other. They met each other in Okinawa, and they're really happy about it. All right, Desert Storm, Desert Storm.
I don't know if you caught that. We're just talking about these two guys from Okinawa. They're servicing Okinawa together. My guess they were probably Marines. And they just got together after 23 years of not seeing each other. But that's also, you hear, he was calling the audience to come join the procession, which is very much like the video we just saw. We got one more, and this is a very poignant narrative. And you're going to hear this individual talk about the heritage. His father was a scout. His grandfather was a scout. He was a scout, and he served in Iraq during the Persian Gulf War. It's a big red one.
I served at First ID. That's also known as the Big Red One. Been in a lot of campaigns, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and I participated in Desert Storm. My job in the military was a scout. From what I understood and researched, my great-grandfathers were a scout in the 7th Cavalry when it served in Fort Sill. That's why I chose that MOS. I had wanted to carry on the tradition, and I did so. When we deployed to the desert, my battalion had 58 tanks, 6 scout vehicles called Bradley, 32 personnel in each of those. There was 5 people in each Bradley. The night the ground war started, or the day of, I got a letter from Anadarko, from the newspaper, encouraging us to do our best. Before I went over there, my grandmother, she prayed for me. She gave me a lot of medicine to take with me. She told me to use it when I felt alone, scared. I did. I wish I could say everybody came back alive, but I can't. I can't even say that for my own platoon. During the ground defense, we made our last passage through friendly lines. They told us out there is no man's land. We went that night, and 2 of our Bradleys got hit, one right after the other. All I could hear were my friends and my comrades screaming over the radios that they're dying. But I knew that I had a job to do.
Actually understand.
Okay, yeah, so he's talking about, his own personal service and loss. And again, there's no singing here, but it's this narrative kind of tradition, a verbal tradition. And I want to close out this conversation about powwow in the sense that I'm going to expose you to some egghead stuff here. An anthropologist by the name of Clifford Geertz has written about, in a non-verbal, non-literary society, which of course we're talking about here, culture can be a text that you can read. As someone reading about this stuff and actually getting an interpretation of a culture like you would in our society when reading books. And so it's kind of a very generalized statement about the power of this kind of stuff. And I'm just going to read the quote. Clifford Geertz provides some key insights into how these non-literate verbal traditions can illustrate what he refers to as a text about a culture which can be read and which helps us understand meaning and the power of continued cultural identity with the assaults of conquest, cultural assimilation by more powerful groups, and even the attractions of both material and popular culture that can wrest away traditions, practices, technology, and even languages that have existed for tens of thousands of years. So kind of getting to your question, sir, this long history that's been not going on for 300-400 years, and we're actually seeing this in our society today. I want to read this again. The power of these more stronger cultural influences. And nowhere can we see that more present today in our own society than the power of social media over our kids. And so I'm going to just read this again. When we talk about the power of a cultural tradition that's not literary, but yet still very vibrant, it's about maintaining an identity in the face of these assaults on not just individual identity, but collective identity as a culture or community. So back to your question, it's a long story of dispossession and conquest, and it's one that's not over yet. We still, around the world, have native communities in the Americas and Asia and so forth that are continuing to deal with the impact and influence of the dominant culture around them. Particularly, there's still some, not quite what I call uncontacted folks in Brazil, but there's parts of the Amazon today that have very little presence of modern society in them. And you actually have native communities that are trying to resist the encroachment of those things because they know how dangerous it can be. So when you go to powwow, you'll see what it is as a way of life for Native American people to keep the past relevant, but also providing contemporary meaning and significance. It's constantly changing. When you go to a powwow, you might see hip hop. There's this kind of absorption of other traditions into these culture traditions that have been both long-standing but also evolved over time. Powwow represents traditions and knowledge that survived tumultuous dislocation, military conquest, and even persecution by agents of change that had no appreciation for Native American religion, ritual, or life ways. So what I'd like to do now is go to kind of more historical discussion. I want to check on my time. How am I doing?
You have
45 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
I'm enjoying this discussion on the powwow because I didn't realize this was a celebration of culture. My only experience with powwow comes from 1950 Westerns.
Okay.
And I always thought a powwow was getting together to
sing.
I always thought it was like come to an agreement, opposites.
That's what I thought it was, yeah.
Yeah.
It was like a treaty kind of.
Yeah, a treaty kind of thing. Was it ever that, or was that just a
Well, the word
holiday?
powwow is an Algonquian word, and it literally means to gather.
Together.
So back in the day, in the 1950s, movies are a classic example. We had all kinds of, misrepresentations or overgeneralizations.
Exactly.
A powwow is like literally a conference. And that comes from, very early days of the colonial presence in basically New England with what we know today as the Algonquian peoples of New England and of course Virginia and the rest of the southern seaboard. So I'll probably go home and do some more work on that one because that's a great question. But, I'm a great film fan, I really am. And beginning particularly in the 1970s, we had kind of more, at least the attempt to become more accurate portrayal of Native American culture. And a great example of this was Dances with the Wolves, which came out in I was in grad school when that happened, 1990, 1991, around there. And of course, that was really the first film that really used documented Native American language with the subtitles in English for the Native American language, and really was quite influential with me in terms of the kind of work that I wanted to do as a historian, as an anthropologist.
Did Indians ever make any money in Hollywood?
Oh yeah,
Chasing out
they did. They were extras, and of course there were a few Native American movie stars. I don't think they made a lot of money. They weren't superstars, but certainly the film industry was an extension of
Yes.
the Wild West shows.
Yeah.
In fact, you could say that the film, Hollywood killed the Wild West shows because when movies and radio and of course TV really killed those live portrayals when everything was really getting to film. But that's a great point. There was a continuation of that involvement with Native American people. In some cases, it wasn't accurate. It was, it was grossly inaccurate in some ways because, of course, in the 1950s, Native American people were always portrayed as brutal, savage, terroristic and that kind of thing. When actually, quite the opposite was happening. Who was terrorizing them, to be quite honest. Just a couple of things I want to, before I leave this. My favorite story about power traditions is in World War I. We sent Native American soldiers enlisted in regular army units, and there are accounts of scalp dances being performed with German army helmets that were brought back from battlefields of France. Now, I'm not saying that they had scalp dances with scalps, but the helmet became a representation of that, which of course represents a long tradition in Native American society, what scalps, obviously play a role in warfare as trophies. But it's just really one of my favorite stories I've heard about. And of course, there's another one I gotta tell you too, it's really fantastic to really illustrate another aspect of this. But that's an illustration of how modern experience in the 1910s and 19-teens during World War I got brought back home to Oklahoma. And you see war dances today, it's not very common, but there are war dances still practiced in powwow. But my favorite story, I hope I get this right, it's called the Charlie Brown song. And I wish I had it, that's for next time. The Charlie Brown song, of course, what do you think about Charlie Brown? When I say Charlie Brown, what do you think of?
Snoopy.
Snoopy. This is not that Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown was actually a U.S. Army general that commanded Fort Sill back in the 1950s. And one day, he went to a Kiowa, I think it was a powwow, some kind of music event, and he heard a bugle being sounded. And it was the sound for retreat. And he got all excited, he stood up, and he rendered a salute, having no idea what it meant. Back in the day, famous Kiowa warrior stole a bugle from a cavalry unit. And he used it, and he learned how to use it, and he sounded retreat, and threw the U.S. cavalry forces into disarray, and that became a Kiowa victory, celebrated with what became called the Charlie Brown song. That's a great story. So make sure I've done everything I wanted to do with this, because this really is the most important part of my conversation. But I do want to talk a little bit about getting to your question about how American bureaucracy and policy impacted Native Americans in terms of this military story. So if we can go to the next slide, I think that'll start that off. So now for a little history, very quickly. These are some photographs of historic Native American soldiers who served in what I call the Old Regiment. That was ad hoc. It was temporary, and they were usually serving as scouts or auxiliaries. Sometimes they were mule skinners, but usually they were combat soldiers, but they usually were out front trying to find the hostiles that the U.S. Army was trying to find. And from colonial times right up until roughly the 1860s and 1870s, that was how most Native Americans served, although there are examples of Native American regular service. The most famous is Ely S. Parker, who was a Seneca sachem, he was a chief in the Seneca community, but he was one of Grant's staff officers. So, but he's kind of an outlier. So, but for centuries, Native Americans have been fighting against each other, fighting with U.S. forces, fighting against U.S. forces through a long period of time of service, which was kind of the foundation for that experience. So we get to the 1880s and 1890s, and things begin to change. And I read this is another great story. What Western historians call the America's 30 Years War is the war of conquest on Native Americans all over the Trans-Mississippi West. And basically take their lands away, relegate them to reservations, as we began pursuing a policy of what we would call assimilation, which is a forced assimilation of Native Americans into American society. And this is going on elsewhere. Some of us are immigrant children. My mother-in-law told me about being put in a garbage can in school back in the 1930s for speaking Italian in class. And her teacher was Irish. So there's this multiple generation of this kind of thing going on. So some of this was, there was all kinds of things going on in America in the 1880s and 90s as America began to try to control and bring into the body politic, if you will, all these foreign folks. And of course, Native Americans were considered foreign at that time in kind of that same conversation. So we have the Dawes Act, which begins to break up the reservations and hand them back to white people. That's what happened in Oklahoma, which had been Indian territory and then was parceled out basically. And the idea was, we're going to break up these reservations. We're going to distribute some of the land to the Native American folks. We're going to give them 60 acres apiece, and they're going to become farmers and live happily ever after. And then the balance of the land can be given to white settlers. And that's where the term Sooner comes from in Oklahoma. The Sooners were the settlers that broke the frontier early to try to grab the best land before everybody else arrived. And of course, another very horrendous part of the story is Indian boarding schools, which you've been hearing a lot about in the news in the last several months, as we're again being reminded of the huge losses that occurred where these students were abused physically and otherwise. They suffered from diseases they were exposed to because there was very minimal medical care. And quite frankly, some of these boarding schools have large numbers of cemetery things. They have burials that we're now hearing about. And this has been going on in Canada too, so something of a scandal up there, because there was less known up there than it was here in the United States. But still, part of this culture of conquering and assimilating Indians. In fact, the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, I can't remember his name, Pratt. William Pratt? Yes, it was Carlisle. The home of the Carlisle, there's all kinds of military things going on in Carlisle today. But the Carlisle Indian School, the phrase was, kill the Indian, save the man. And literally these kids would be rounded up in the reservation, thrown on trains, sent to these Indian schools. Carlisle was just one of them. And they would literally get off the train and still be in their Native American clothing, or their own clothing. They would be given Western clothing and assigned Western Anglo names, typically from the Bible, beginning at A and going through Z. And that became their identity while they were in school. So this is a very controversial, very difficult conversation because it was young children, sometimes young 6 or 7. When I was in Oklahoma, I heard stories about women hiding their young children in their skirts when agents would come and round up the kids to go to school. Some of the boarding schools were local in a sense that they were within the region, but the kids still went away, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. And the idea was really to break the connection of those children to their communities and to their language and to their cultural traditions. So in this context, we have some theory, which I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on. It's funny, I was reading Nell Painter's book, Standing at Armageddon, last night, African-American historian, very well accomplished, who talks about this time period. Her title of her book is Standing at Armageddon. And then my personal favorite, Robert Wiebe, who has got a book called The Search for Order. And they're both talking about how did American society deal with the chaos and the change that occurred from the 1870s until the early 1900s. In 1870, America was rural and agrarian. By the 1900s, America had become urban and industrial. This huge change. We had all kinds of immigration at that time period. Many of us have ancestors that arrived in America during this time period, and they were literally kind of thrown into what was called a melting pot. And of course, many of their their languages were done away with. I know in my Italian family, that's my wife's family, about the only thing that survived is the food, which is great. But that's one of the few connections to the old country is the food traditions, language is long gone. So in this environment of professional development, and the next slide, I want to talk about these Army officers. Wonderful story. Young men, they were ambitious, and they wanted to find a way to get ahead of their colleagues. There was a very slow promotion period at this time. You could be a lieutenant for like 20 years. And there was, the Indian Wars didn't generate a lot of ability to promote. And so any way you could stand yourself out was a way to pursue some kind of professional development and notoriety. So we had two individuals. I probably need to get to their names.
You have them underneath.
Do I have them? Oh,
Yep.
Yes, Robert Casey, who is my personal favorite, and Samuel Robertson. They both worked with Native American communities in Montana. And Robert Casey, they both actually took their regular soldiers they had enlisted. They were mostly cavalry types. And they responded to the Pine Ridge Reservation troubles that Pine Ridge, Wounded Knee was part of this. But the last really major engagement, which was really a massacre at Wounded Knee, it was part of the Pine Ridge troubles. At the time, it was thought the Sioux were this large community, they had lots of firearms. The worry was there was going to be this outbreak and a return to the old Indian Wars. And in the middle of this, these two gentlemen brought their troops of soldiers. They were Cheyenne and I think they were Sioux. And in particular, Robert Casey, because you're a historian, I'm a young guy, I'm working through this documentary material, chronological order. I just fell in love with this guy. He was accomplished. He was a West Point grad. He kind of represented the best America could offer. He goes to Pine Ridge and gets killed by a Native American warrior who had just come back from the Carlisle School. And it's a real tragedy. It figured largely in the papers. Eventually, Plenty Horses, that was the name of the young man who was 17, who killed him in an ambush, was exonerated. He was not convicted of any crimes, in part because there were hostilities going on, and so it was a legitimate combat situation, but also because there had been several murders of Indians by white settlers, so you very well couldn't put Plenty Horses and Huskow if they didn't take care of the justice thing. So they teamed up with then Secretary Redfield Proctor, who was a progressive, and that led to the actual experiment with enlisting Native Americans permanently in regular units commanded by white officers. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how this became part of popular culture. That's why I have this painting actually in my office. This is Frederick Remington. Actually, this is a pencil drawing that was put on Harper's Weekly, which was a Time magazine of its day. And Frederick Remington, also well known as an artist, became a promoter of what these guys are doing out west. They just thought it was romantic and exciting and kind of America's answer to the Indian problem, and so it was very much featured in popular media. Next slide. And so this is a photograph. I think this is the group out of Fort Keogh, Montana. And this is kind of the very beginnings of photography out in the field. But you can see that they're wearing regular Army uniforms, and of course, in perfect formation as cavalry. And then I want to talk about a couple of individuals that kind of represent this experience. So we have Wolf Voice and his family, who's one of the troopers at Fort Keogh. I don't know a whole bunch about him, but I know a lot about Sam Houses because I worked with his family in Fort Sill. And Sam, he eventually became a lawman. He was a farmer. He worked at Fort Sill as a civilian employee of the Army. And his children today are lawyers, doctors, scientists, teachers, and a world-renowned artist whose work is featured in the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C. So they kind of, for me, represent the individual story of they were trying to make a living, they wanted to connect to their warrior past, and they saw their enlistment in the U.S. Army as a way to do that. And of course, that presages a much broader engagement of Native Americans in integrated service after the turn of the century. It's really interesting to look at the Army. The Army always fights the last war, right? And I can say that about our U.S. military. We are very well prepared to fight the last war we fought, but sometimes not so prepared for what's coming next. And we all know what's going on in the military with drones, and it's been going on in Ukraine, what's happening now in Israel and the Middle East. You never know what's coming. But the Army was still stuck on fighting Indians up until it was forced to figure out that it had new things to worry about. One of them was colonialism in the Spanish-American War. And of course, you know anything about the Spanish-American War, we sent our soldiers off to war in clothing that was best suited for like Minnesota, not for Cuba. And we had lots of soldiers die of tropical diseases and poor equipment and poisoned food. That's another story. But anyways, the Army had to adapt. And so next slide, that's where we get into World War I, which there's this huge need for manpower, and we begin integrating Native American military service into the military. Of course, these are the classic doughboys, the old tin hat, and of course, those are Lee Enfield rifles, still in the inventory in World War II. We have come with what we had. I have one of those hanging on my wall at home. But anyways, this is where 20th and 21st century service begins. And it has its role in technology. You've all heard about the code talkers. The most famous code talkers are Comanche and Navajo, but there were several other groups during World War II. Mostly, I think, in the Pacific Theater. And literally, they took these guys and they trained them in modern technology, radio communication, and they used their language to encode frontline battle communication so the Japanese could not understand what we were doing. There are very few Navajo speakers in Japan from 1941 to 1940.
Were the Native Americans segregated from other troops?
No, they were integrated. They were integrated right from the beginning. They were not segregated. Yeah. So these are Choctaw code talkers. There were some very early experiments with telephonic communication. We didn't have a lot of radio in World War I, but we did have wire. And so the first code talkers were actually Choctaw Indians from the South that served, I think, in Europe during World War I. So
Have you ever been to the Code Museum over by Fort Meade?
I have not.
They have recordings of the different, you can hear from each of the different groups. It's really cool.
Yeah, I've never heard recordings. That would be something really to add.
It's worth going.
So I also want to add that women participated in big numbers in World War II across the board, of course. I don't know the numbers, but there's significant Native American women participation in the war. And of course, broad participation of Native Americans in all theaters. Some of our most decorated soldiers during World War II were Native Americans.
And the soldiers, the right photograph on the last slide,
Yes,
those are Marines.
those are Marines. You can tell from the uniforms. Absolutely. Yeah. There was a very strong tradition of associating the Marines, especially in the Great Plains, especially in Oklahoma. Okay. And then, of course, the service continues long after. You can still, there's getting fewer and fewer World War II veterans in the powwows, but they're still there. I think there's still a handful of code talkers still alive, but they're few and far between. But certainly, Vietnam and all the wars after are very well represented. I did some statistical checking, and I think currently we have over 14,000 Native American soldiers serving in the force today, out of a total of about 1.2 million. Total active duty soldiers. I think right now over 150,000 veterans in the United States classify or self-identify as either Native American or Native Alaskan.
Whose
Yeah.
idea was it for Native Americans to be code talkers?
I don't know where this. It's a brilliant idea. You know, we had very little way to encode actual real-time communication at the time, so that's a homework question for me. I'll go figure that out.
Yes.
It's a great idea.
Whether some.
Can you bring up her name, please?
Oh, sorry.
So just want to outline the sacrifice and service. This is Specialist Lorianne Pestawak, who's a Hopi, who was killed in action in Nasiriyah, Iraq on the 23rd of March, 2003. So these folks really they've served. I was just reading about the numbers of lost combat soldiers from Shiprock, New Mexico, which is a very small community northwest of New Mexico. So that service has continued during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and up to the present day, and I guarantee you they're on our ships, they're in the Marines, they're in the Air Force, they're in the Army and Coast Guard, and as I mentioned before the last census, I'm sure that number has grown. We have over 150,000 Native American veterans in service, or in our population today. So that's about where I'm at. I would love to have a discussion at this point about anything anybody wants to talk about. These are code talkers, Navajos, and you can see the Marine symbol on their hats. And wherever you go to a powwow, if there's a code talker in the audience or on the floor, you know who he is. Still very much celebrated to this very day. Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, you said that the Native Americans were integrated right from the get-go in all the services. Whereas the blacks, the whole first half of the 20th century were, if at all, were totally segregated.
Like the Tuskegee Airmen.
Sure. There
Yeah.
was no integration in the U.S. military for African Americans in 1954.
But there were a lot of people of mixed race, of Native American and black. Which category did they fall into?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's really an interesting question. There were Native Americans in Oklahoma and Indian Territory that owned slaves. And of course, there was a lot of kind of mixing, particularly in the South, as frontiers moved to the West. Just like there was Anglo Native American mixing and marriages and childbearing and so forth, there was certainly that going on with African American, Native American communities, particularly in the South, particularly in Louisiana. It came down to what you could pass as. And passing, of course, that's a whole conversation in Native or African American history. Many times because of the persecution and discrimination, if you were African American and could pass as a white or pass as a Native American, you would do so. But that obviously in many cases was a personal choice and one, subject to some peril. But that's a question I really don't know a whole lot about. Another homework question for you. Yes, ma'am.
Did any of the nations with their language, has it been kept and passed down through the generations?
It has, and with the larger communities, for example, I broke down a Zulu trooper. I lost my water pump in the middle of the Navajo Nation one day, and I could not find anybody who spoke English in the local community, although they knew what was wrong with my car. So that was the Navajo Nation. There's still native speakers. The most Native American tribes that are organized have language programs. I actually participated in Apache language classes in Oklahoma. I could count to 10 and learned just enough to get in trouble with the Navajo students I worked with in Utah, because Navajo and Apache are related dialects. But there are active efforts to maintain language, but sadly, there are many Native American languages that are either gone or they're being lost, because one of the issues that I saw, for example, in Oklahoma, there's no post sixth grade study of the language, because after you leave home, you have a pretty good, imagine if you stop speaking your language when you're in sixth grade. You go out in the community and you really lose track of that. My mother-in-law was an Italian speaker as a child and was probably very fluent, but by the time she was an adult, she had really trouble recalling. I was a Spanish linguist in the military, and I've lost my 3.3 rating because I simply haven't maintained it. So one of the challenges is English is the dominant language in most of the communities they operate in. It's very hard to maintain a native fluency when you have a second language as sort of your dominant means of communication.
Were they written languages as well, or just strictly?
Mostly verbal. The one example of a Native American language that did have a written alphabet, and was the Cherokee under Sequoyah. He actually invented or discovered, I don't know how you call it that, but he actually invented a syllabus with an alphabet, and there was written Cherokee in language. So, and there are, using Anglo alphabet, there certainly is, and I don't know how many of them are, I know Navajo is written in English, or written with the Greco alphabet that we have. But yeah, various levels of survival going on, and it's really, think about how long these languages have been around. 25, 30,000 years, probably in some cases. It's really fascinating. If you look at linguistics, it wasn't my expertise, but for example, Apache Navajo is very close to some Asian dialects spoken in the Amur River Valley of Asia. That's an area kind of right between China and Russia, and there's words that are almost identical but not changed over that time period. Those people have been separated beyond. It's really fascinating.
Count to 10 in Apache.
Oh, can't do it.
Is it different sounds than we know?
Yes, a lot of stops.
Signs, yeah.
Like I'm thinking Dashlehe. That's the number 6.
What is it?
Dashlehe. So there's like this tongue thing going on, and it clicks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult to learn how to speak it. I know from my own background, I was associated with the Mormon tradition, the Mormon culture, and I think the hardest language for missionaries to learn in the MTC in Utah is Navajo and Japanese for very similar reasons. Great question.
I was curious when you were talking about culture and how it was passed down. Was it passed down through stories that families told? Because when you were talking about it, I was picturing, almost like the pictographs and that, that type of a story. But I was confused as to how those.
That's a great question. And the question is, how is culture passed down through the generations? And it's all those things. In non-literate society, it's verbal, but as you have pointed out, there are things like pictographs and paintings. And I lived for a long time in Utah, and some of the wildland areas of Utah, you still have very vibrant survival. The pictographs in particular, they're actually pegged into the rock. And there's a lot of conjecture that they were used to transmit religious concepts, keep track of time. You find depictions of animals, you find things that are very literal. You also find things that are very abstract. And sometimes there's some thought that they're geographic, that they actually are portraying places that they would go hunt and keeping track of where things were and that kind of thing, but no alphabet. So really it's a verbal tradition over time, and this is why in the scope of human history, grandparents are so important. And probably one of the major aspects of human evolution is the human beings able to survive long enough to be grandparents in order for grandparents to play that transmission along with parents.
Has the culture continued of having grandparents in the home?
Well, unfortunately, because of a lot of social problems, we see this in a number of places in American society today, many grandparents are raising their children. Opiates, medical problems, diabetes. I was out in Montana just before the pandemic, and I kept very close ties to my folks out there. The pandemic had a very tremendous impact on Native American communities because of lack of access to health care, pre-existing health conditions, diabetes being one of the major ones. And so I got a personal friend of mine who I was very close to in the powwow culture in Montana who's raising her children. Yes, sir.
I got a tough way of formulating this question.
Sure.
So this is a question to a historian. Okay? Richard Hofstadter from Columbia University years ago said, we need to learn about the future from the past. Okay? So when Michener wrote Centennial, he talked about assimilation. You alluded to this already, the Italians, the Irish, even the Russians, that sort of thing. They seem to assimilate pretty well. What are we doing, again, in high schools and universities, in political science, maybe sociology classes, to learn about the failures of assimilation with the Native Americans in the future, in the context of today, where we're getting into identity politics? We're getting away from assimilation.
Right.
And so, are there some lessons we can learn, or are any universities making some effort to kind of educate, that maybe we could do a better job?
Well, I'm going to repeat the question because it's a very complicated one, but a good one. And first of all, Richard Hofstadter, awesome historian. He's one of my heroes. I've read many of his books. And the question is this, we went from a pattern of assimilation and acculturation, which was obviously very destructive and really created a lot of problems for folks. And now we're going to this era in which it's really about individual identity or corporate identity, depending whatever that is. And I'm going to try to thread the needle here and not get myself in any trouble. Bottom line is we are not doing a good job of this. In colleges, I think we're doing a better job of it than in public education because we have what we call a general education curriculum that we're hoping that all students are exposed to some level. They have to take math. They have to take English. There's some requirements to take sociology or some social science. There's some requirements for history, depending on where you're at. But unfortunately, history is not one of the common requirements. Sometimes it's grouped with other ones. But I really do think that one of the reasons we're in so much challenges today, particularly on the political front, is the lack of civic awareness of the upcoming generations about how the American system is supposed to work, constitutional laws. basic elements of what I call liberal democracy. And I don't mean liberal in the left-wing Democrat sense. I mean liberal democracy in the classic conversation about the founding fathers and the traditions they came from. They came here, I shouldn't say founding fathers, the framers. I'm a very strong advocate of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which are diametrically opposed documents. They both deal with rights to a certain extent. The Declaration of Independence was this aspirational document. The Constitution is how we made it actually work, because the system we had before the Constitution was a mess. And I love living in Maryland. I have the State House in Maryland on my office wall in Annapolis, because that's where the conversation started that ended us up with the Constitution. Because Articles of Confederation were a disaster. There was no taxing authority, and without taxation, you can't have government, and there was no structure. We had all kinds of actual wars going on between the different states over who owned what territory and so forth. And so the Constitution provided this kind of roadmap and structure for a structured government. However, it enshrined within its verbiage slavery under the 2/3 or one. Not the 2/3. The 3/5 compromise, thank you very much. In which slaves were defined as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation, which was a compromise that allowed the Constitution to actually exist. Because the South could not have come along without it, because most of its people were not citizens and could not vote. And the North didn't think they should be able to be counted for representation. But where would that have left the South in terms of the power of the North? So that's a really difficult question to talk about that stuff. Because we're still dealing with the reverberations of slavery, the failure to do things right in many respects in terms of how we treat our underserved populations in this country, African American, Native American, other groups. And that's kind of an ongoing challenge for all of us that we're in the middle of, presently.
Imagine what it's like in California with all the Hispanics coming across the border. And they've had the same issue about voting rights for them.
Yeah, but let's remember where California came from. 47 is actually part of Mexico. We won't get into that conversation. But yeah, these are very challenging conversations. I don't have a lot of the answers, but I think I think Linda would agree with me. We're not doing a great job of educating our young people at almost all levels. There's so much competition, and now we see this real shift, I think, necessary to workforce preparation. But we are losing a focus on general education and things like anthropology and history and languages and all those liberal arts things that all of us took for granted back in the day when we went to college. So, yes,
I was going to say, don't put all the blame on the public school teachers, because as soon as they bring up points, such as what we're looking at, the oppression of the Native Americans, the parents come in and say, you're not teaching Americans, you're making your child uncomfortable. Don't tell my child that European Americans did bad things.
Well, I certainly don't want to, I will clarify my statement. I am not criticizing our teachers, so they've got enough on their hands. And if you know, I have, well, here we have somebody very close to me over here. I come from a long line of public educators myself. I tried substitute teaching once in my local high school. Too scary for me. But my wife actually is doing character counts in the local schools in Queen Anne's County. And they are so glad to have her come in to kind of take some burden off of them, because they're being asked to do so much with relatively so little. And that's Queen Anne's County, which has, relatively speaking, a lot of resources. But our public education system in general is challenged by a number of issues which are not about teachers. It's about something much bigger.
They're not supposed to present minorities in a positive image. No,
I never got that message.
we all.
Yeah, it's we are living in interesting times, and my first 3 years in public school were in Arkansas. I attended a school that, as a young person, had just been desegregated, and sometimes I really wonder how much progress has been made since those days. Yes, sir.
So how did you settle in on Native American history as the topic of your thesis?
Well, first of all, it's about finding a job. If you haven't been able to tell, I'm a frustrated military historian, because that's really what I wanted to do. And I'm being somewhat facetious. But the problem is there's not a lot of jobs for military historians, and I also had the CIA thing I was dealing with where I didn't want to have to. For one thing, I was very interested in the Civil War, extremely interested in the Civil War. Also very interested in World War I because of my own grandfather's service, where I grew up with almost constant stories about his service in World War I. But anyways, I gravitated towards Native American history because I had a long-term interest in it from as a child. In third and fourth grade, I had a Seneca friend that I grew up with in Western New York, Ted John, his name. And we had a lot of fun together. And I don't know, I was always a kid that my family moved around a lot. There was a lot of instability in my upbringing, and it was very positive for the most part. And we eventually settled down in Western New York when my parents finally split up, which was a long time coming. But bottom line, it's always kind of a new kid. And so you find that people that go into sociology and anthropology are people like me, that we're always the new kid and we're always kind of like an outside looking in. And one of those explanations for people like me is we're always trying to figure out where our place was in things, because we really weren't connected to the local community. Like, for example, my wife, born and raised in the same house until I took her away after she graduated from high school. But she has friends who go back to kindergarten, Catholic school. And I don't have any of that. You know, I found a few elementary school friends from my elementary school days on Facebook, and they don't look or they don't pay anything like what I remember. Their politics are really strange, but we're friends. And, but anyways, where was I going with that? So it was a combination of a long personal interest, probably some individual psychology things I had. When I was an undergraduate, I was worried about finding a job, so I majored in political science, thinking that would get me a job, which it actually did. But then when I decided to be a graduate student, I really wanted to go teaching, and I really loved history. And so at St. Bonaventure, I was a generalist. And then I went out to Oklahoma and went out to do Native American history. And a real good experience, a solid experience. I haven't even talked about this. I have my own powwow story. So I was a graduate student at St. Bonaventure, and the Senecas do not have a strong powwow tradition. They've never had it. But then we talked to the tribe, and I actually had a Seneca friend that I was a colleague with, who was a graduate student, and they decided to have a powwow, and St. Bonaventure agreed to sponsor it. And as a graduate student working in the graduate school office, I was involved in setting up the logistics. And as part of that, we had a man by the name of Larry Howell, who was a Ph.D. at Potsdam, SUNY system in New York, who was a Seneca expert. He actually testified in numerous cases about Seneca land claims and so forth. And he came and did a graduate seminar. And I took that. That was my first dedicated Native American history class I was hooked. And in particular, he's an oral historian, kind of stuff I do. It's called ethnohistory, where you talk to living people in addition to doing archival work and reading old musty documents in an archive somewhere. But I loved actually interviewing people, old people, young people. That's what I did in Oklahoma, which is that anthropological kind of thing. My favorite story in Oklahoma is that they were trying to light a fire and couldn't figure it out. But I helped them light a fire from their powwow at the Apache tribal headquarters, and that was my Boy Scout background.
My powwow was 1978 in the Iron Furnace in Snow Hill. And they still do powwows there today because the Salisbury area has such a rich Native American history. I'll never forget when we hired Roxanne when she came to as a Yes.
Yes.
She told me that she had just moved to Salisbury, and I said, "Oh, which county?" She said, "Wicco Neco." Favor and never say that again.
I gotta tell this story because Clyde Ellis is such a good friend of mine. Luke Laster, the one who recorded those powwow scenarios, they both went out to Oklahoma because they've been Order of the Arrow Boy Scouts. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Order of the Arrow. It's an Indian-based folklore kind of fraternity. And they were very interested in the Indian song and dance from their work with the Order of the Arrow Boy Scouts. And they wanted to go to the center of the universe for Indian dance and music. And they ended up in Oklahoma, and it became the rest of their lives. So there's some, I got tapped for Order of the Arrow, my Eagle Scout, by the way. But I never did one of our deals, so I never went through that. But that was not my thing. But it was just interesting. I got colleagues that really started out in Boy Scouts, determined their interest in this. And Clyde's still at it. In fact, he's working on a book I don't think he's going to ever finish about what's called white hobbyism, which is white people dressing up like Indians and doing song and dance traditions. OA is part of that story, But it's really quite interesting because there's people in Germany that do this stuff. And they actually have their own
There
power.
are two powwows coming up if you want to attend. November the 11th at Bowie State. Bowie State is doing a powwow on their campus. And then November 18th is the 47th annual powwow in Timonium.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And another item that, this was in our newsletter for November, was at Hansel. And they're doing, there's actually in Cambridge, at the library, they're doing a book, they're coming to talk about the book There There, written by Tommy Orange, which should be a fascinating program if you get a chance to do it. It's this Sunday, I believe, the 12th. That's this Sunday.
They did that here in Easton too. They had several conversations in Easton.
But I'm wondering if we could talk you into taking a group to one of the powwows.
Sure.
Wouldn't that be fun?
I would love that.
That would be
And
great.
maybe I could get Clyde else involved. My client is up here on occasion, and he is the expert on powwow culture. And I have an article for you. You can look it up online. It's called, I actually was going to try to provide a link, but I couldn't find one. It was available. It's called We Don't Want Your Rations, We Just Want This Dance. And I can't remember where it was published, but I'll get that to Lynn. But if you want to read more about where powwow comes from, which is, there's a lot of my notes come from his paper, it's a fantastic exploration of powwow, all these fascinating elements that come into the Wild West shows and Indian military service and traditional Plains Indian military societies. You were fascinating. Ronald, I want to give you a chance. You can hear us. Do you have any questions or comments you'd like to share with us? Okay, he's shaking his head no. Am I out of time?
You are.
No, I'd like to mention one thing.
Sure, go ahead.
There's a wonderful book out there called Touch the Earth. I don't know if you've ever heard of it or not. But it's a self-portrait of Indian existence. And it has great sayings from a lot of the Navajo, all the different tribes, the sayings and their stories and things. It's a great book for anybody that wants to get into Indian culture.
Awesome. Make a note of that.
Some months ago, the local historical society, county historical society, has a series of lectures, and sometimes I can get to them. And I did get to one, I think it was last winter, where they had, I think, 6 members of Eastern Shore tribes, all there, some in full regalia, and they all talked about they all, of course, knew each other, even though they were all representing different tribes and their different roles. Is there any possibility if we find a powwow there could be an Eastern Shore variety?
Yeah.
Well, but there are, I know there's one at Vienna every year, and that one's actually heavily influenced by Mexican traditions, which is a very interesting thing. It's always a crowd pleaser because they have these amazing.
Well, maybe what we could do is leave it to you and Linda maybe to come up with one. We're always looking for field trips.
Sure.
And
The
that's,
Manicoes have a wonderful one, that's over in Millsboro.
oh, yeah,
Area, and
yeah.
that's always in the fall, and their chief was a woman.
Yeah.
At least up until 2 years ago.
A lot of Native American society included Center for Matrilineal. And they actually were the leaders, they're called clan mothers. And in those societies, the women ran the show. They sent the men off to do warfare and hunt, but the women took care of things, and I love it. I think it's one of the
1 minute left.
One of the Pueblo people, if you're gonna divorce your husband, you just put his shoes out the front door and you're done. Yes. I just wanna thank you for a great class. Wonderful, you got in the classroom, we really do miss, although I don't miss the grading. But I would be glad to come back sometime and have another conversation, but thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you so much. This is fascinating. And we would love to, really, we would love to take you up on doing something like that.
Goodbye, you can invite us as students.